So at the end of the Second World War, Swiss politics and Swiss neutrality were internationally compromised because Switzerland had maintained relationships with Nazi Germany, Nazi German officials, Nazi businesses, and Nazi everything else until its demise as it was a neutral country. The Soviet Union only reluctantly accorded diplomatic recognition to Switzerland in 1946, which had been the herald of anti-communism and anti-communist activities in the early interwar and post-World War II world. So in 1946, agreements with the Western Allies, especially the United States, compelled Switzerland to compensate for the looting and diluted Western European central banks, Jewish boxes and safes that will not even be open to this day, art theft, gold, Nazi gold, and even the Kingdom of the Lost Skull, with some 250 million Swiss francs. Because Switzerland would receive no special recognition in its neutrality, the Federal Council decided not to join the United Nations or the UN, which nevertheless still occupied offices in Geneva. Joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO or NATO, the US led Western alliance against the Soviet bloc, was never really a serious option for the country in Zurich, Bern, or even I don't another Swiss capital. Was never really a serious option for a country that believed armed neutrality had been the best defense against Nazism and would also save the country from communism. The Cold War allowed Switzerland to again become a respectable member of the international community. Neutrality enabled it to play a mediating role between the two antagonistic camps of East versus West, or East versus West, yeah. But as a capitalist democracy with a strong citizens' army, it was a tacit member of the non-communist world and one of the key defenders of Western liberal democracy. An interesting and even complicated mixture of neutrality, isolationism, solidarity, anti-communism, and even a bit of state socialism, and even militarism became a common, often complacent ideology of most of the Swiss people, but be they bourgeoisie or be they socialists. So in 1959, the so-called Zubile or the magic formula for the Federal Council, was established, under which it was composed of two liberals, two conservatives, two social democrats, and one member of the peasant-based Swiss Cheese People's Party, or the Swiss People's Party. This formula, which would actually persist until 2003, permitted the government to sidestep party rivalries and even to distribute Switzerland's growing wealth and build a strong social welfare state. For a long period after the Second World War, the undamaged Swiss economy experienced very little unemployment, and it grew approximately 5% per year from the 1950s up until the 1960s. During this period, foreign policy was virtually reduced to negotiating bilateral trade agreements. And because Switzerland avoided multilateral ties that could affect their sovereignty and, of course, their neutrality, it resisted the European integration efforts in the early 1970s. Thus, it did not join the European Economic Committee and the European Coal and Steel Community, all of these which were later be compiled into the European Union or the EU. Instead, it was a founding member of the European Free Trade Association, though, or the EFTA, in 1960, which would be a conglomerate into the EU. So Switzerland's economic growth rapidly changed the landscape and the living standards, helping to perpetuate the image of a country as a special case or a Sonderfall. It would renounce multilateralism only slowly and gradually within apolitical international bodies, including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1966, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank of 1992, and the World Trade Organization of 1995. In 1971, the World Economic Forum was established in Davos as a gathering for the decisions of policy making, economic trade, and even social issues. By the early 20th century, by the late 20th century, and by the early 21st century, the name of Davos had become synonymous with globalization and international decision makers and making, who would regularly attend the meetings at Davos. Switzerland's strong economy would attract migrants firstly from Italy in the post-war 1950s and Spain after Francoism in 1975. And after the 1980s and the late 1980s, from Yugoslavia, or what would be the former republics of Yugoslavia, and Turkey. Xenophobic political parties began to really attract significant support and even power from about the 1970s on, though initiatives to reduce the numbers of foreign laborers were only narrowly defeated in parliament. Nevertheless, during the 1970s, many foreign workers, particularly those in construction and watchmaking, famous for their watchmaking, were forced to leave as a result of the sector restructuring and their rationalization of restructuring. By the early 2000s, however, foreign citizens constituted nearly one-fifth of the Switzerland's population. This high proportion resulted in a large measure for the legal and even the political difficulties involved in naturalization. Now, let's rewind. Switzerland also kept a conservative approach for several other issues. For example, women were only enfranchised on the national level by early 1970 or 1971, and in the canton, or basically a U.S. state or district, parish, something like that, the canton of Appenzell, they had to wait until the early 1990s for full voting rights. Radical, dude! I'm gonna put this ballot in a box. Word! Relatively late to the game in early 1981, an equals right amendment was actually added to the Constitution, and in 1985 the rather patriarchal marriage law was actually amended. Another problem that had lasted for decades that was resolved pragmatically in early 1978 was when the national referendum authorized Jura, or the Jura, a French-speaking Catholic area of the Protestant canton of Brenne, to form its own canton. So in 1960, the student revolution and revolts common throughout the West still left their traces and left their mark on the country. But the bourgeoisie majority fiercely rejected the Marxist ideas, believing the Sondervoll was working perfect. Changes in lifestyle, gender relationships, and even popular culture did not spare the Halavalik Island or the isolated kingdom, and the successful opposition against atomic power stations in Brussels were one of the triggers for a strong environmentalist movement in the early 1980s, or Nukes versus Moms, or something like that, I can't remember. Changes in lifestyles, gender relationships, and even popular culture did not spare the Halavaltic Island, and the successful opposition against an atomic power station near Brussels was one of the triggers of a strong environmentalist movement and environmental movement. So a youth rebellion originating in the 1980s in Zurich caught international interest, as did Needle Park, a temporary free market for drugs, in years to come. But by the 1990s, Switzerland was one of the world's wealthiest and the most prosperous countries in Europe and in the world, and the neutrality, still the country's official doctrine, became more complicated and more complex as the world goes on. So in 1986, 73% of the voters actually rejected to enter into the United Nations, despite the endorsement of the members to the most mainstream politicians. Though opposed to joining the association, Switzerland sided with the UN. Though opposed to joining the association, Switzerland sided with the United Nations against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. And there lies Switzerland. So at the end of the 1950s, reflecting on both the threat of a possible invasion by the Soviet Union and the realities of the nuclear age and nuclear warfare, Swiss military doctrine changed to mobilize defense that could include missions for the Air Force outside of its territory, in order to defeat standoff attacks and even nuclear threats from the sky, including the possibility of defensive employment of air-delivered nuclear weapons. However, the inability to field an air force of sufficient capability to carry out a mission of such magnitude led to the return of the traditional protection of own terrain doctrine, or Fortress Switzerland. Meanwhile, the Air Force also began to prepare for the ad hoc air bases in the mountains, with sections of highway strengthened to act as runways and hangars carved out of the solid rock of the mountains themselves. So in the early 1960s and in the late 1970s, the armed forces were organized according to Army 61 structure, or the Army of 1961. During the Cold War, Swiss authorities actually considered the construction of a Swiss nuclear bomb, leading to nuclear physicists at the Federal Institute of Technology Zurich, or the FITZ, or the FITZ, such as Paul Schuler, made this a realistic possibility. However, financial problems with the defense budget prevented the substantial funds from being allocated to an actual nuclear bomb, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 was seen as a valid alternative and a better alternative. But, despite all of this, right, all remaining plans for building a nuclear weapon were only dropped by 1988. Where they go, Switzerland? So in 1989, the structure of the army as a national icon had been shaken by popular initiative aiming at the dissolution, or the Switzerland without a army consent, receiving 35.6% of support. But the actual thing about this, right, still low, but the actual thing was that everybody was trained to be in the army at this point, so the fact that it received 35.6% is actually alarming and very shocking, because everybody, kind of like the IDF, has to go through military training. And if something like this was to go in Israel, it would be like immediately 2%. So I think they were expecting like 10% max. But this still triggered a series of reforms, and in 1995, the number of troops were reduced to 400,000, still a marked increase for most countries, but a country of a couple 100 million, 400,000 is like pocket change. If it was a country in like the Caribbean, that would pretty much mean the whole population. And this would be called the Army 95, or the Army of 1995, sorry. Still stuck in that Cold War mentality, dude. Article 50. So Article 58.1 of the 1999 Constitution repeated that the army is, in principle, organized as a militia, implicitly allowing a small number of personnel and soldiers. Switzerland is a multicultural land with German, French, Italian, and I believe there's a small minority of somebody else. Oh, let me check. This is the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. This is just for the viewers that stick around to the end. But let's go. By language or something like that. Like, who really inhabits, right? So it's basically, let me see, French in the west, German in the center, Romish in the middle, sparsely areas near to the Austrian border, and Italian obviously at the bottom of the border. Not a bad map. There's other maps like this. Bren, Yodorvan, Dodomokik, Zamat, Sin Mojit. I'm here looking for the big boy towns. I don't see Zurich at all. Do not see Zurich. Oh look, Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is right there. That's cool. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I think I really figured out how to speak. Horizontal speaking is actually kind of good, but actually in the long run, actually not bad. But it still kind of stretches out the voice and the vocal cords when speaking downward. Actually helps with a lot of pronunciation and a lot of other stuff. I know sometimes I might go fast, and you know the kids are outside, they're jumping up and down, they're going crazy, but I really think I got it now, boys. So 1989, let's go. TikTok, Zurich watch, Swiss cheese, nuclear bombs drop. Learn something.